Welcome everyone to today's webinar on the 2024 revisions to the EPA's RMP rule focused on the safer technologies and alternatives analysis. I'm Stephanie, your host for today's session. Today we'll be delving into a key aspect of the recent changes. The RMP final rule includes requirements for STAA, which is in effect a review of inherently safer technologies or design. In this session, our speakers will discuss the stated requirements for these reviews and how operating companies can plan for and implement them as part of a process hazard analysis process. Before we begin, I want to encourage all of you to actively participate in today's webinar. We value your questions, so feel free to submit your questions through the webinar using the Zoho webinar Q&A box. We'll be addressing your questions during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We will be recording this webinar and we'll make the recording available to you within the next couple of weeks. And if you'd like a PDH certificate, please email us at contact@acutechconsulting.com after the webinar. We'll have this email address up on the screen at the end. Please note that the opinions shared today are only the opinions of the presenters and they're not providing any technical or legal advice. But now let me introduce you to our speakers who will be guiding us through today's topic. We have David Moore, founder, president, and CEO of AcuTech. David has over 40 years of specialized experience in process safety and risk management. Mr. Moore's expertise includes the management of process safety and security, PHAs, quantitative and qualitative risk assessment, OSHA and EPA compliance, process safety engineering, fire protection engineering, and emergency planning. We also have Mike Hazen, a senior principal engineer. He is a CCPSC with over 45 years of experience in process safety and risk analysis, security, engineering, and plant operations. He's authored or co-authored several CCPS guideline books on process safety auditing, process safety culture, and security, and he's contributed to the books on inherent safety and mechanical integrity. And finally, we have Mark Farley, managing partner of Farley Partners, a preeminent national workplace safety and crisis management lawyer. Mark has served in lead attorney roles for some of the most significant U.S. industrial accidents and transportation incidents in the last 20 years. Mark and his colleagues also counsel clients on chemical accident prevention requirements, including the U.S. EPA risk management program regulation. All of them bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise in the field, and they'll be sharing their expertise and insight with us today. So I'll now pass the virtual mic over to Dave, Mike, and Mark to kick off our webinar. Dave?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and we really appreciate you being here, and also the fact that Mark Farley is joining us here to give legal perspective. We have on our agenda to talk about an interesting topic, and that is one element of the new revised EPA risk management program, which is the STAA requirements. So we'll do a deep dive on that. There's a lot to unpack. We'll do as much as we can here. We want to start by talking about inherently safer design and inherently safer technology, and that's an even deeper topic. So, that's the basis of this, and I presume many of you are familiar with that, but we'll want to review that. For further information on that, we can show you some references or speak with you later. Then we're going to go into what exactly EPA is asking for here, and then we're going to give some of our perspective on what we believe are some of the challenges, the issues with implementation, some of the risks, including even legal risks and regulatory compliance risks. So I'll start out by talking about the fundamentals, and I hope that this is a review for most of you, so we'll do it quickly. And, this is not a new thing. This is something that is well understood by industry to be a useful, holistic approach in order to make an operation such as handling highly hazardous chemicals safer as possible. It focuses on reducing or eliminating hazards, and that's the key thing to remember. It's not satisfied with just layers of protection on top of hazards. It's really challenging whether the hazards themselves can be somehow modified or even eliminated to reduce it fundamentally. It also is very, very practical in that when it's simple, it's simple. When it's not, it's not. If you can substitute a chemical easily, it seems very logical. If you have a highly challenging, complex process, it seems very infeasible. So we'll talk about those challenges. The history of this is, way back in the 60s, ICI Chemicals in the UK, and famously Trevor Kletz, who's also credited a lot with the HAZOP process itself. He published a paper back in 1977 from work that they had been doing where they were trying to solve the problem of making a process safer without adding more and more complexity to it for safeguards. And they called it the paper, "What You Don't Have Can't Leak," which is very profound. And I remember and remind you of this because if you keep that in the back of your mind, it does really motivate you to try to do what's possible. Really, it's been a voluntary process up to this point. There are regulations which we've been deeply involved in over the past 10 or 15 years, such as in the New Jersey State Toxic Catastrophe Prevention Act and the Contra Costa County, California Industrial Safety Ordinance, where these are actually requirements and there's experience with it. With varied levels of success. And so what the significance of the EPA RMP is it's now national. So we're going to talk about two things because EPA mentions both of them in the STAA. One is called Inherently Safer Technology, or IST, and the other is Inherently Safer Design. And what's the difference? Well, let's talk about technology. This is the actual technology, the process, how it's working, what the license or technology is, what's the mechanism by which a process operates, and so forth. And for a very complicated process, particularly one that's a license that you're utilizing, this isn't easy to modify. This is something that is, it works a certain way, and if it's modified too significantly, it may not work at all. So in addition, though, there's something called Inherently Safer Design, and this is broader. This means technology, but also equipment, or the way in which it's operated, or the administrative controls. And so the ISD, I was pleased to see EPA included that because in the CCPS guidelines, we purposely made sure that ISD was actually what we were talking about. And therefore, we're giving the idea that the difficulties of changing the technology of a process, which are very limiting, were not the only solution to implementing inherent safety. So what is a chemical manufacturing process that's inherently safer? By definition, it means that you somehow reduced or eliminated one or more hazards associated with particularly the regulated chemicals in this case, that makes a hazard that you used to have either completely eliminated or is modified such that it's lower likelihood or lower consequence. And there's a variety of definitions that's been published out there. But by the fact that EPA has said ISD or IST in the process of conducting an STAA study is acceptable, we assume that means that they don't only mean wholesale changes to your technology. They mean some incremental, inherently safer design changes may be acceptable. And of course, we're speculating here. They certainly understand that, and they even referenced the guideline book. But they've given really no guidance on exactly what they mean by safe enough or inherently safer technologies or inherently safer design features. They reference industry practices. Mark, any comment on EPA's intent there?
No, I think you're absolutely right, David. And obviously, we'll have to watch it closely as EPA develops guidance around this point in the future. But I agree at this point, I would operate from the assumption that they are amenable to these incremental approaches. Again, they haven't set a specific risk reduction target in the regulation. And so I think that supports a view that a owner operator can take an incremental approach.
Now, this is an example that's published in the CCPS guidelines where, a methyl acetate production was more complex. More complex theory is what you don't have won't leak. Can we simplify it? So they simplified it to this other process. And that looks good on paper, but that may be an almost unimaginable change for the company that has already invested in the option on the left. And I can't guarantee that the option on the right is any safer necessarily. So this is an example of why I was happy that it's not only the technology, the process. Now, let's refresh what we actually mean by a chemical hazard. I mean, it's all about making the chemical hazard less likely to be realized into an event or less consequential should it happen. And so chlorine, for example, toxic by inhalation. We can't really avoid that per se. So what can we do? Possibly we're going to have to modify that or substitute to make an impact. Hydrogen is flammable gas. We can't, deny that as long as you're using hydrogen, it's flammable. That's the fundamental hazard. So we're either going to have to substitute entirely, eliminate, or modify. And which hazards do we think that EPA would be most concerned with? It's really speculation, but given that they have a list of regulated substances, obviously that's what the rule is all about. So they have toxic and flammable substances, which is a minimum, but they also ask you to do worst case scenario, alternative release scenarios in your offsite consequence analysis. And so everyone up to this point who has an operating plan under this rule has already told EPA what they thought the worst case scenarios were. My recommendation would be that they take a hard look at those and see if they can make a difference in the impact area, particularly if it affects the public. Also, if there's an accident history trend either at your company or that site or within industry. So these are a couple areas that EPA may be focused on, particularly if they do a proactive inspection of a site. These long-winded definitions I'm only including for you to see that there are different definitions out there. The CCPS in their guidance book that we wrote included this definition, which essentially says it's an approach to make sure that you either eliminate or reduce hazards associated with a set of conditions in order to focus on the hazard and see if you can reduce or eliminate, make it permanent and inseparable. Well, EPA in the new rule defined inherently safer technology or design together. And they said risk management measures that minimize the use of regulated substances, that substitute less hazardous substances, that moderate the use of regulated substances, or simplify covered processes. And why would you do that? In order to reduce the likelihood or the impacts or the severity. So they gave you a very broad brush. It's consistent with industry opinion. And so we have a lot of, I guess, leeway to interpret that as we see fit. This is the CCPS guidelines I mentioned, and actually I'm showing all three versions of it. Originally, this was done by committee, and then version 2 and version 3, we led the development of these guideline books, and the latest one was published in 2019. So, this would be a good reference book giving you lots of ideas and examples, and including some of the complications of using inherent safety. So I include this just long-winded discussion because in 2010, the Department of Homeland Security was concerned that maybe they should use inherent safety for security as well. And they asked CCPS to come up with a definition, and they came up with a longer-winded definition. And I'd have to say, if you read these sub-bullets, what you realize is it's not quite as simple as it sounds, is how I would summarize their new definition. On the other hand, Trevor Kletz put it very simply. He said it's safer because of its very nature, not because some equipment has been added to make it safer. So he was particularly clever at few words to make an impact and tell it like it is. The strategies that are in the CCPS guidelines are pretty well understood, and they are basically agreed to by EPA to minimize. Trevor Kletch used to call it intensify, substitute, moderate, he used to call it attenuate, and to simplify, which he called error tolerance. So in the guideline book, we pretty much followed the original ideas and modernized it a bit to simplify it. And what you'll notice if you read the STAA requirements of EPA's new rule, they have not stopped at inherent. They said, look, consider all inherent. But if you can't do this, then you need to consider a passive safeguard and analyze that. And if that can't be done, then an active plus procedural safeguard. This is the first time that we've seen anyone demand safeguards be studied of inherent, but also demanded that they be implemented in this hierarchy of controls. This hierarchy of controls is another industry idea that they're basically now requiring be considered, and that you actually have documented passive or active and procedural and documented consideration of inherent.
And I might add, David,
Yes, sir.
that this is the first time that any process safety regulators, federal, state, or local, has made risk reduction measures of one sort or another, as Dave just described the types, mandatory as a result of doing some analysis. That's never occurred before. This is the first time.
Now, those of you who do process hazard analysis by, say, HAZOP, you're real familiar with that. At some point, you think the risk is acceptable to you. And there is no common risk matrix. OSHA and EPA both don't publish one. So you're using sort of RAGAGEP and industry best practice and your own decision tree to decide if it's acceptable. And if you look at the, say, unmitigated risk, and you realize that's probably not acceptable, you're putting independent protective layers onto the system normally in order to draw it back to an acceptable level. And this is fine, and this process should absolutely continue. But I just wanted to bring to the point that ISD ignores that a bit, at least initially, and says, I know you've already done all that, but can you do something more? Can you look at this hazard by itself and try to find a way to modify, substitute, eliminate it, which may eliminate all these layers of protection. In the best case scenario, if you could find a clever way to get rid of it and it didn't impact your business, the question would be, why not? The dilemma is that this isn't always possible. So in the end, you probably end up with some combination of incremental ISD where possible with layers of protection. And this is right out of the guidelines books. Nothing EPA is saying is foreign to us. What's foreign is the requirement to do it and the requirement to have alternative safeguards if, say, inherent does not work for you or passive does not work. So you notice here we say avoiding hazard. It basically means getting rid of the hazard altogether. This is the purest form of inherent safety. If I could find a magic, way to get rid of a chemical that I just simply don't need, and that was one of the regulated substances on the RMP list, well then, bravo, I got rid of a chemical. And that's inherent safety in practice. And I know that when New Jersey regulation was first introduced, and it had the inherent safety requirements under the TPCA that we talked about, that one of the first things that happened is people got rid of any unnecessary chemicals. They may have substituted, say, sodium hypochlorite for chlorine or what have you, and therefore they're out of the program. This is the bottom half of that. You notice that at some point, we've done everything we can for inherent safety, and then we apply passive, active, and procedural safeguards. And so if you can come up with a way to completely eliminate, we call that a first order inherent safety initiative. It's like top drawer that we really did a good job. We don't have that hazard anymore. If I could do a partial, I'm still okay with it. We call that a second order. If I can't do either of these, then we're into the layers of protection. Now, let's look at specific language. What are they actually requiring? First off, they say that there's this new thing called STAA, which is really a process that they're bolting on to the PHA process. They're asking you to do more. They actually are inserting it into the same paragraph of 40 CFR. So, but they are limiting it to only certain sites at the moment. The word I read where is maybe close to 12,000 sites, maybe 1,200 will have to do this. And so the NAICS codes 324 and 325 are subject to this. And they're subject to it, number one, if they have a process that's located within 1 mile of another RMP regulated facility. That's also 324 and 325. And what that means is, let's say that you had, you were next to another RMP site, but it wasn't in the same NAICS codes, then that would not be applicable. And this means 1 mile fence line to fence line, not process hazard to process hazard.
And by the way, they derived that 1 mile criteria by examining the worst case scenario data for all RMP facilities, the 12,000 that Dave mentioned. And they came up with 1 mile based on some sort of average distance between, oil and gas producing facilities and general chemical manufacturing. And that's how they came up with the 1 mile. That is the first time that they have used the worst case or the alternative release scenario data, other than just collecting and tabulating it for some other regulatory purpose.
Yes, and also it's very clear that they're focused on clusters of what they would consider highly hazardous sites in close proximity, and particularly the public that has to face being within the multiple envelopes of those worst case scenarios in their mind. That's what they're focusing on. Refineries, petroleum refineries using HF, there was about 45 in the United States. And this is no surprise to them. This has been coming for quite some time. In fact, the 2017 proposed rule included this very same requirement. So we've known for years that there was interest, and hydrofluoric acid has been a particular focal point for the agency for quite some time. So no surprise that they called that out, and that one is not dependent on the distance to another RMP site. And then the third one is the one I find the most interesting, really, and that is that 324 and 325 that's had only one accident that meets the RMP accident history reporting requirements since the most recent PHA. So they're figuring the most recent PHA included an STAA already under the new rule. If you have another incident, then you would want to or have to revisit this, because now you have a requirement for an STAA again.
David, we have a question just to respond to.
Yes.
Individual asking, how are industrial parks treated if there are multiple NAICS 325 companies in the same site? And there, it really is going to turn on, are you in the right NAICS code, and do you have a program 3 process? If the answer is yes, and if one of your neighbors, again, in that park, or, we often see these chemical condominiums, so to speak, of formerly integrated sites. If your neighbor is subject to that code and has that level 3 process, you do have to do this. And that's certainly how we're looking at that.
That's right. Yeah, thanks for calling that. And let me know if there's other questions that are related. We'll happy to answer them. And at the end, we're going to try to do some Q&A as well. Plus, we'll answer every question that comes up back to you. They consider STAA to be part of the PHA process. So your PHA element is not complete until this is done in future here. You have to include at least one member who works in the process and has expertise in the process being evaluated. And that's not a shocker because that was similar to the PHA requirement, but we would challenge and say, how many PHA team members are qualified to answer all the ISD questions, are knowledgeable of alternative technologies, or can answer the practicability questions that you're going to have to justify this? And so it's a little more sophisticated. I have done this before with teams that are really good at it and do most, if not all, the work. But I'm anticipating that this will be a two-part piece of work, more than the usual PHA. It's going to be a discovery with the usual team, with perhaps help from experts within your company or else outside your company that know about this. And then it's going to be a lot more back office documentation to justify the practicability if necessary. Now, you can do these as either independent ISD studies, which means that, okay, I got my HAZOP over here and I do my ISD study over here. I have different teams. By the way, we do a lot of these. They're not nearly as time consuming as, say, a horrible 4 or 5, 6 week PHA. You might do this in a few days or less. But they did not limit you to have to do it as an integrated study, but you can do it that way. You can do it while you're doing your HAZOP or your revalidation. I would add one little caution that I have done some where the PHAs were not done very thoroughly and they weren't trustworthy. So when they ask us to do an ISD study on top of that, I always like to go back and say, well, what did the PHA team say for the hazards of the process? And we found that their rankings were off, or their safeguard documentation was weak, and so honestly, it might be a necessity to look very carefully at the PHA that was done to make sure it's consistent with the ISD study. Now, you can use whatever methodology is, industry standard is what EPA seems to be saying. They mentioned checklists. They mentioned what I call a strategy-based study, which means you go through the 4 strategies of minimization, et cetera, to see whether or not there's opportunities. And I'll show you that.
One other thing just to mention real quick, Dave.
Yeah.
Although those books that you saw are essentially the primary references that are out there that CCPS has published, just a cautionary note, CCPS itself would not consider those books, or any of their guidelines books for that matter, to be recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices in the same manner that, say, the ASME boiler pressure vessel code is considered a RAGAGAP. So just keep that in mind. If there is other guidance that your company has, or you've developed locally, or it comes from someplace else that essentially does the same sort of thing, then you can use that as well.
Yes, and someone asked whether the CCPS guidance is in line to be updated because of this. I know of no such thing just yet, but it's possible in the future, but not at the moment. And by the way, as we mentioned, EPA themselves has not published any guidance at all on how to do this. So on the other hand, in the 2019 version, we anticipated a lot of this for the CCPS guidance, and we put a lot of good ideas in there, and I don't think any of that's invalid. It's just that the way in which they want you to document and follow this process, it's different. So here's the hierarchical part. You're to look at inherently safer technology or design and document what they call a consideration So they're not really forcing you to do this. They're forcing you to consider it and to document it. And then if you decide you want to adopt something, that's fine. If not, you're going to have to justify why not. But then in their mind, the hierarchy of controls flows, which we believe it as well, but they more or less said you have to document a passive measure. And I would say that's a little naive because passive does not always equal the same as inherent safety. I'll give you an example. An inherently safer to where I try to eliminate or minimize the fire hazard by substituting a non-flammable for solvent for a flammable solvent. Whereas a passive might be like, say, fireproofing, or it might be a curb or a dike to limit the spread of a fire or what have you. They're not one and the same. And so I found it a little odd that they would talk about that hierarchy in quite that way. We had the hierarchy because we were trying to simply add additional layers, and passive is recognized to be more reliable than active measures. And then lastly, active plus procedural. And most people have active plus procedural already. The bottom line here is it's about documenting, and it's about trying this, and it's about, sincerely seeing what's possible and being ready to defend if you just were to say, yes, there's a lot of things out there that are possible, but I'm not going to do any of them. So, you would want to be careful in that case, because what they're really doing is having you document a lot of considerations. And there could be fellow industry sites that already have made similar changes with their processes. So you're going to have to have sufficient evidence to demonstrate that implementing this is not practicable. Why not? And so there's what they call a practicability assessment, which most of us in the past would have called it a feasibility assessment. And they define it as a, capability of IST or IST measures being successfully accomplished within a reasonable time, accounting for technical, environmental, legal, social, and economic factors. They don't give you much guidance on what all that means. You can kind of guess, but they basically clearly say you cannot come back and say the only reason we're not doing this is it's ridiculously expensive. So cost cannot be the only rationale. It can be a rationale, and it should be. So should time to implement. But they're expecting that there are other factors.
And the cost is supposed to come last.
Now, I'm going to quickly go through a couple of examples. This comes right out of the book. They reference the book and they say, you could do checklists. Well, this is what it would look like. Could be as simple as this, where you go through the different strategies, substitute, etc., and you ask these questions. Now, I caution you on one thing. This is only a checklist. It's only a for example. And many of the questions are not applicable. That's why there's this column, is it applicable? And then if there's an opportunity if this inspires an opportunity, that's the idea, then you would say, well, here's how I interpret in my case. And then you would document a feasibility and a recommendation and an action plan. So it's simple, but a lot of the questions may not be relevant. And it could be that by just using a checklist, you're not giving it enough engineering thought. This is a different method. This one is an example of various questions that have been brainstormed. That's probably a little better because the idea of checklists is to help support, not necessarily to be the complete universe of possibilities. Now, this is what I would say is a minimum, more modern approach. The first 6 or 8 columns are nothing more than repeated 3 times here, a scenario The scenario is we have a tank. It has a flammable liquid. And during the HAZOP, if you can see this clearly, it says potential for overfill of tank 100 due to human error in operation. So what it means is I'm trying to attack a hazard. Now, here's a hazard scenario. The hazard would be that we have flammable liquids in storage and someone could overfill this tank. If they did, would it have a public impact? Apparently this is a summary of the HAZOP. Is all I've done is just summarized the cause and consequence. The answer would be yes, it would have a potential public impact as well as on site. So they ranked it pretty high and they ranked it pretty likely, and therefore they got a high risk. So normally what we would do is we'd say, well, we have a high level alarm, we have operating no more than 95% of the tank level. So in other words, there's a little slack there for catching the overfill. We have a tank dike and we have firefighting foam if we had to mitigate it. And you might have said that that reduced it so much that now we're in, say, the ALARP region, or possibly we're in the green, we're in the low region. And we would be considering that enough. So the last 4 columns here challenge that, say, with an ISD strategy of minimize, is there anything more I can do? So minimize is just it provokes a thought. It's like a guide word in a HAZOP. And the question is, can hazardous raw material inventory be reduced? So the suspicion is if I don't have as much to release, maybe it will benefit. So they made a consideration, let's assume, consider reducing the inventory in the tank. And they thought of another one. We could also see if a smaller tank could be used so that there isn't as much released in that case. I'd have to challenge that one because it could be the smaller tank means it overfills more frequently. But this is all part of the challenges of IST and ISD. So the last column would say, okay, we got a couple of ideas. Let's study those, and you have to make a decision. Now, you may not necessarily make the decision here in the meeting, but again, you'd have to make a decision. And the last sentence here says, but if I decide not to implement it, then I have to fall down to the hierarchy of controls or another ISD or IST idea. Because in my mind, we have 3 identical considerations for the same scenario, but different strategies. All we're really trying to do is brainstorm ways that we could reduce this. And they're not saying you have to have a solution for every ISD strategy. They're just saying you have to have consideration of ISD. So it could be that one strategy, like simplification, produces no ideas. And that's okay. But if one of them does, then you got one. If you don't, then you move on. If you do and you're not going to implement it, you have to document it. So here's another idea. What if we substitute, and instead of worrying about limiting the amount of material in the tank or making a smaller tank, what if we just get rid of that chemical? Because after all it is a solvent, and there's alternative solvents. So we said, consider changing to a different solvent that has a lower flash point or isn't flammable. And if the solution is no, there's no other solvent that will actually suffice, we're back to where we were before. And it goes like that, and it's iterative. Okay, so I hope that gives you a little idea of what the practice is going to be and what, practically speaking, how it works out. Now, interestingly, I read in the preamble, in defending the idea that they were going to force this on you, but actually not require you to do it, and it was going to cost a lot of money. This is actually 70% of the total cost estimated for the entire changes of the EPA RMP rule that's just been passed. They said, well, besides the benefits of reduction of all of the losses that we might expect, to the public and injuries to people and so forth, they're expecting that you're going to find out that some of these things may reduce your operating costs, your maintenance costs, your productivity improvements, and even capital and facility cost reduction. So I say this because we've experienced a little bit of this, but not always, because I think a lot of people are fearful that this is going to just, ruin the business, cause a dramatic cost for us to make these improvements, and possibly we have to get out of certain activities. And just so you know, the agency is expecting that it's not all bad.
Well, one thing the agency is not requiring anybody to do, and they stated this in the preamble, is they don't expect anybody to establish, basic scientific research and, come up with, the design of new chemicals all on their own. The IST and IST measures that you should consider, say in that worksheet discussion Dave just showed, are stuff that's either commercially available already, or the development's been done by others and has been proven to a certain level. Whether it applies exactly in your process or not is a different question. But you're not required to, set up your own research center and do the first principles, chemistry and physics to come up with new stuff.
Yes, they said that exactly. I wanted to start talking a little bit now in the time remaining on complications and issues we see and things that you should be prepared for. First off, you really need to get ready to understand all this and figure out a way that your teams are going to do this. It's been, since the early 90s to hone our methods that we have right now. And now all of a sudden, if you've never done an ISD study, let alone one that is for STAA, there's some work to be done to figure that out. So we recommend that you don't just start with day one and say, well, how do we do this? Get prepared and have a method, and make sure you understand how that can be effectively done without causing a lot of grief to you. Also, bear in mind that the PHA teams, as we mentioned, may not have the right expertise. So it's best to prepare, maybe supplement the team. If it's too challenging, have a completely separate study, and perhaps bring in, a licensor or an expert on process design, or someone that can help you with the factors that you're going to have to figure out. And that also includes when you're trying to justify the whole thing. And then, Mark, I'd like you to speak to the last couple of bullets, if you will, please, because they're more along the lines of regulatory impacts and legal liabilities.
Sure. And obviously, as David has mentioned, there's not a specific requirement that you implement every sort of IST that you identify. But our concern, certainly from a legal perspective, is how is the documentation developed by your team looking at these issues going to be viewed and used by others, either in the context of EPA routine inspections of RMP covered facilities, or probably of bigger concern, post-incident, when it might be the Chemical Safety Board that is looking at your IST analysis, or to the extent that it's post-incident, it's now OSHA or EPA or a U.S. attorney looking at these issues in the context of other investigations into the incident that occurred. And obviously, what we always see post-incident is those documents are just going to receive very close scrutiny, where people are going to second guess the judgments of the team, and even the engineering judgments of that team. And so how you document these issues is going to be important. Certainly plaintiffs' lawyers, after an injury, after a major accident, are going to be very interested in this work product, because from their perspective, it demonstrates an awareness of the hazard, an acknowledgement by the company of here's what we could do to make it safer, and then ultimately a decision to only do X, Y, or Z. And so what we are saying to our clients certainly is, as your organization prepares to develop a program around this, certainly consider having a standard, a policy, a procedure, something that is going to systematize how you do this across multiple operating sites, if you have multiple operating sites, Certainly your legal counsel should participate in the development of that standard, and then you should look for opportunities to in effect have hold points in the process where the team is conferring with legal counsel on how things are going to be documented. I recognize that that's not the way that you would normally do a PHA, but I think until your organization develops a muscle memory on how to approach this, especially with respect to documentation, getting the benefit of legal counsel through that process is going to be absolutely essential. The only thing I would say also to attorneys who might be participating in today's webinar, consider opportunities to use the attorney-client privilege in the context of some of those discussions. Again, we don't want to stifle the good back and forth among the technical experts in terms of what the options are, but we do want to make certain that that back and forth is not then subsequently used against the organization post-incident or in the context of EPA enforcement.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. There's a lot of issues. One that I found interesting was going back to this comment. The first bullet repeats what the rule now says. It says there's a third case, and that's where if you're in 324 or 325 and you've had only one accident that meets the RMP accident history reporting requirements since the most recent PHA, then you must do an STAA. So that's a low bar. And I was just thinking ahead about, okay, how big of an impact is that if you're in 324 or 325? Particularly if you're not within a mile fence line of another site and you thought you were free of this. Well, you know, just think about it. What's your 5-year accident history? Now, this has not changed from the original definitions. And there was one revision that said you have to report this within 6 months. But other than that, EPA has not changed their opinion on what should be recorded. They're just referencing it now for the STAA. But you notice the first bullet, a release that has one of the following: on-site deaths, injuries, or significant property damage. You may have thought that EPA only had consideration for off the fence line and beyond in the public and the environment. But what this says is incidents that had on-site deaths, injuries, or significant property damage could trigger an STAA. And then, of course, the latter is if these larger events that may go off-site causing environmental damage. So we could have, say, a regulated site, a process that's covered, a regulated substance, a release, environmental damage, or an evacuation, shelter in place, and suddenly we have to do an STAA study we didn't think we had to do. Now, some companies might think, well, then perhaps we should look at STAA to get ahead of the curve. And, you know, a lot of people have been voluntarily doing that all along, by the way. More on that, though, they talk about, of course, every time you update your RMP, you have to report this. And don't forget that there's going to be some public access that didn't exist as easily before. So you're going to be reporting these incidents. So there's going to be expectations that, well, now you're probably addressing inherent safety when you weren't before. And a couple other instances that I found when I looked through the guidance document that was published a long time ago, I had to dust it off, still applicable. It says, well, what if I simply purchased a company and they had an incident, but they hadn't done an STAA study before, is where I'm reading between the lines. And I think the answer is, well, if they didn't do it, you're still accountable to report it, which means it's yours now, which means that you would have to do an STAA study of the process. Also, if you have a large on-site incident, but there's no off-site impact, yes. And then thirdly, well, what if people went to the hospital outside the site, which I've seen a lot over the years. You know, people are either they're worried well, they are really injured, or they are looking for something to gain. And so they claim that there was an injury. If they claim and there was a record of that, what EPA believes is you have to report that. So there's lots of opportunities. The bar is relatively low if something was to go wrong, is my point.
Dave mentioned guidance documents. If you look on EPA's website, the RMP part of it, you'll see roughly a dozen different guidance documents of various types. Some are aimed at certain types of facilities. Some are aimed at different types of RMP activities that you have to go through. They changed the regulation, but they have not yet updated any of those guidance documents. So everybody will have to a little bit hold their breath to see how those guidance documents change, if any, like the one Dave just described. Will they modify that to, reflect STAA and other changes to the RMP?
Yeah, there's also complications we're expecting. Like what isn't clear right now is where they say that you have to attempt a inherent, but then go to a passive, and if not that, an active and procedural. Well, what if you have passive, active, and procedural today? You probably do. Can you credit those? It would seem absurd to me that they're forcing you to add something just for the sake of adding something. There, especially with no bar as to what is acceptable risk. The reason we do in, say, LOPA analysis additional safeguards is we haven't reached the acceptable risk criteria yet. But here, I imagine you've already done that, and most of your processes are within that zone. And now they're saying consider passive, active, and procedural in addition. So our opinion would be this: we have to wait and see what they actually mean, but it doesn't seem rational. You could always take a hard look, but you may have to, inherent safety may not be a big problem, but the problem may exist with the compliance to the passive, active, and procedural. Another issue that we're concerned with is what I call the macro view versus the micro view. So think of the bird's eye view of a process. Bird's eye view, if I look at a process and say, what am I doing here? Well, I'm producing, say, some sort of substance that's regulated, and that's my business. I make that substance. Well, the macro view would say, this is really threatening to my business. I need that chemical. I need it as something that I use every day. It's integral to my process, or it's what I make. And so what about a micro view? Well, on a micro view, it's a little bit less stressful because perhaps I can find a vessel or a dead leg, or I can use a catalyst or simplify my controls and improve safety. So industry believes micro view, which I talked about in the beginning of this, incremental changes, I called it, is a good idea. I mean, after all, if we can do something that's justified, that reduces the likelihood or consequence, and it's an inherently safer idea, why not? So we'll have to see what EPA thinks of that. And then there's the so-called first or second order I mentioned with that colored diagram showing the hierarchy of controls. Yes, it would be great if we could eliminate all hazards, but that's absolutely not expected here. And I don't think EPA believes that either. They're really asking you to tee up these ideas. And then I'm not quite sure what will happen with all that information. But, the $1 million question is, how forceful will they be to say that doesn't seem like a reasonable study, or that you should have eliminated this hazard? Because I could imagine that I could make some minor improvements to something, but stick my guns to say I'm not going to get rid of that chemical, even though it's possible to get rid of it. It's going to be interesting to see. Another thing that you have to realize, and we mentioned this earlier, is that you could be totally satisfied with your level of risk from a LOPA standpoint, say, or a HAZOP standpoint, and you haven't been challenged before, but now with ISD, you could be challenged, So really, it's about going deeper to try to get to the hazards of the process. And by the way, I'm a firm believer that codes and standards and good engineering practice and so forth, we don't put unnecessary risks. There are some things that when you really look at it, you could have done it differently. we might have substituted, but it's not like industry was doing everything the wrong way, and now we're forced to do the right way. Also, a lot of people think inherent safety to this day is really only useful in the early days when you have a blank sheet of paper. And I just want to mention, it's not only for new facilities, and we mentioned that we talk about life cycle possibilities. And now with regulations, we presume they mean if a new process comes in that you're going to have on file for the PHA that's required, an STAA study. They don't talk about MOC. They don't talk about changes. So when you do a change and you're supposed to do a hazard evaluation, does that modify your STAA? That's not perfectly clear. It seems sensible that it should, but it's not absolutely documented as such that I've read. And then there's documentation, and we're just listing here for your reference things that we think they mentioned, things that we have, from our experience, felt are necessary. There's more documentation going to be required for this than there may be in a HAZOP. It tends to be that the phrases in the HAZOP columns are enough, and here you got more information that you're going to have to do. For further information on what I'd call the regulatory issues and all of the challenges that we can think of, I had to give testimony before the Senate Public Works and Environment Committee back in 2006 about inherent safety, and I wrote a paper on that. It's available here on this link. But besides all the stuff that we said way back then that's still relevant today, there's a whole chapter in the CCPS guidance on challenges, that you'll face. And I would say, looking at that, you should prepare yourself to how I'm going to not be naive about that and fall into some traps. Just two more things, then we'll finish. One common pitfall of ISD is here we are with good intentions and we're causing impacts that we didn't even anticipate. If you know John Muir from the Sierra Club, he was he said well-intentioned people trying to do something about the environment can mess it up for the rest of us, essentially. And an example of that is interestingly, I found this history, and EPA themselves, published this article talking about how refrigerants, which are, by the way, the number one use of anhydrous ammonia and the number one chemical that's being regulated is in refrigeration and cold storage and this sort of thing. And it was really the fact that these are toxic and flammable refrigerants that they had an initiative to try to find a non-toxic, non-flammable refrigerant. And when they finally did in CFC refrigerants, they didn't realize the environmental impact of chlorofluorocarbons. So by switching to this and everyone jumping on this, we didn't realize we were making an impact on the environment. And so I'd caution you that when you make changes, be careful what you're doing. There's the so-called balloon squeezing theory, and that is, I can't get something for nothing. Nothing is risk-free. If I try to make some substantial difference but still operate, like, for example, I get rid of all the storage I have on site to reduce my local exposure, I probably created an impact on the transportation sector and on the same public I'm trying to protect. So we want to call these things, to your attention to be sure that there is no guidance on how EPA will evaluate that or whether, what you can do about that. It's going to be quite an interesting initiative to try to figure that out, or what makes the most sense. That's what we had. We finished exactly at 3:30. But I see a number of questions. If anybody wants to cover any of those questions, you can hang with us. Otherwise, Stephanie, would you mind mentioning about the next event?
We'll be hosting next webinar on Monday, June 3rd at noon. You can register with the link you see here, but since you're already here, we will be sending out A registration link to everyone that participated in this webinar, so you don't need to like quickly write this down or anything. So look out for an email from us in the next few days. If you can't make this time on June 3rd, we will be sending the recording to the webinar to all of those who register. So yeah, like I said, look out for an email from us on this upcoming webinar. And so I guess, do we want to take a few questions? I see we've got quite a few more that have come in.
There's a lot of questions here. I'll try to answer a few of them, and Mike or Mark, if you can help me. One's talking about, now that it's part of the 5 years and there's a revalidation cycle, do we believe STAA is part of that? And I'd say yes. That's a pretty good guesstimate.
Yeah, they hitched this requirement to the PHA, so the requirements for when you do a PHA are going to drive pretty much when you're going to do an STAA as well.
Yeah. Let's see if there's anything else. Someone asked if does the practicability study apply to the entire facility, or is it limited to just the program level 3 processes? It's limited to the program level 3 processes.
In that regard, on the practicability assessment, EPA used the same criteria, 5 criteria: environmental, legal, social, technical, economic, as the state of New Jersey did. And if you go to New Jersey's TCPA website, you can get a guidance document that'll more fully describe what those 5 or 6 words mean in the context of doing an ISD analysis. So there is some guidance out there that exists. Obviously, it hasn't been adopted by EPA yet, but there is some written stuff out there that'll help you think about those criteria.
Mark, would you mind answering the question about how do you define significant damage?
Yeah, happy to do it. As I mentioned just in the answer I sent around, EPA unfortunately doesn't provide any guidance, and they just basically say the owner's got to document it. I hit send prematurely when I was typing out the response. I think using CSB's threshold in the incident reporting rule is a basis that you could use, but obviously it's not dispositive. I think it's a factor that you can consider in coming up with an independent judgment about whether or not it's significant property damage. The biggest reservation I have on the CSB rule is CSB feels that it should take into account business interruption. And I know that that's a point that industry has long resisted.
Okay, there's a question here about whether a cost-benefit analysis would suffice as a practicability assessment. Well, perhaps. I mean, I wouldn't be quite so quantitative about it because there are social factors, there are technological factors, and cost factors, and a number of things that should be taken into consideration. So, like for example, some of the social factors and so forth might be the benefit of it, which might be the reduction of impacts. And that's, I think, going to be one of the toughest parts of it. I can tell you what it costs for option A and option B to construct, operate, maintain, but I'm not necessarily can I tell you how many lives I'll save or with option A, B, and what that ultimate benefit may be. And that's going to be a tough thing to disprove is, if in fact making a change would say eliminate an entire impact to the public or to the workforce, what price are you going to put on that that is justifying not doing it? So it's going to be very, very difficult, I think, in some cases. By the way, there are ways that I think you're going to be measured that are also potentially a reference point. Like, for example, have others in your industry that EPA has seen done what you said is not possible, and they readily did it, voluntarily did it? It's going to be problematic for you. So you have to be careful if you were to say, it's impossible, I can't get rid of, say, this solvent. Well, someone else found an easy substitute. And at the moment, we're not expecting EPA to be coming in and making all these incremental decisions. We really don't exactly know what they'll do. They're, I think, more hoping for improvement than they are teeing up a bunch of situations that they will have to come in and make hard decisions and say this is unacceptable, but we don't know.
Great. So we're already 6 minutes over, so I might close this out now. But if you sent us some questions that we haven't addressed yet, don't worry. We get a record of these questions and the team will follow up with you individually to provide answers. We're just glad you're engaged on these webinars. So I want to thank our speakers, Dave, Mark, and Mike, for sharing their expertise and shedding light on the upcoming changes. And I also want to express our thanks to each of you for joining us today. Your active participation in these questions have really made this engaging. This was part 2 of part 3 series, as I mentioned. So you have information here, and I see that people have already started registering for part 3, so that's great. We'll be sending out a link to the recorded webinar once it's available. Feel free to revisit the content, share it with your colleagues, or delve deeper into the insights provided today. If you need a PDH certificate, email us at contact@acutechconsulting.com. It will also be in the email that you'll receive in just a few minutes. And once again, a big thank you to our speakers and to all of you for being a part of the conversation. And we look forward to connecting with you again in part 3.
Thanks very much.
All right, thanks, guys.